Hello everyone, this week I've once again worked on the Mario Kart 8 Deluxe custom track we've been making for like a month now called Wiggler Wilds. In the previous episode of this series, we started focusing on the track's intricate visual design elements, because like I said at the time, I felt like it was pretty much done in terms of its gameplay design, but what's happened between then and now is that the first episode of this series, in which I asked for gameplay related feedback, has finally released. And a lot of your guys' comments were genuinely really insightful to the point where I decided to throw out my plans for this week and instead revisit the track's gameplay design. The three main points of feedback I got during the first week were that the shortcut route should be made more interesting and tricky somehow, since it skips all of the track's most gimmicky sections. The rotating log part of the track shouldn't start with a blind jump and end with the player dipping into the water, and the Wiggler should become red and angry and walk faster during lap 3. I guess I also have to mention that the single most prevalent suggestion was specifically that the shortcut route should be made more interesting by turning it into an anti-gravity section. Though since I've already designed the terrain to fit this part of the track, and honestly I don't think driving on the walls would make the route truly any more fun gameplay-wise, we're not gonna do that, no. Okay, so then how are we gonna make the shortcut more interesting? Because most of the road of this route is covered in boost panels, I decided my best bet was to try to add something to these two jumps in between. Probably my favorite Mario Kart track gimmicks are the ones that require the player to adjust to the movement cycle of an upcoming obstacle, such as this swinging spike ball in Bowser's Castle. So I wanted to add one of these hanging above each of these gaps, which I figured would work really well from a gameplay perspective. In terms of visuals though, not so much. So the question became which jungle-related Mario enemy could feasibly function as a swinging ball of collision that damages the player. The answer was, of course, scuttlebugs. These spider enemies tend to hang from webs and fit the New Super Mario Bros. Theming of the track. There were three problems with the idea of replacing the spike ball with a hanging scuttlebug though. These guys don't appear in that many games, so I don't think they've ever even had a high quality model. The spike ball doesn't have a skeletal animation that could be used to make the scuttlebug animate, and even if it did, since I don't know how to convert animations ported from other Mario games to Mario Kart 8 or anything, how would I animate the scuttlebug? Thankfully, I remembered the first problem had actually already been solved for me years ago by my friend Flizzle, since he made a high-ish quality scuttlebug model for the mod Super Mario Evolution, which I felt would fit Mario Kart 8 with only a few small tweaks. Alright, so we had a model, but what about the animations? Like I said, the original spike ball doesn't have a default type of skeletal animation, and since adding one that should play automatically didn't result in any changes in-game, I assumed this was never gonna work with this file. I figured I could solve this by using a different actor's model and renaming it to trick the game into thinking this thing is the spike ball, but instead that caused a crash. After some trial and error, I figured out that because the spike ball's rotation animation is a part of the actor's code, when the game can't detect the bones that are used for it in the model it loads, it freaks out and crashes. So all I had to do to load a different model was add those bones to it. Later I realized the only reason my attempts to add a skeletal animation to the spike ball originally didn't work is because Track Studio doesn't save the state of this loop checkbox half of the time, which is frustrating. But either way, we got there in the end. At this point we had a model and a file that played an animation we could replace, but still not an animation to replace it with. Now, if you've watched some of my Super Mario Bros. Wonder modding videos, you may know that I do have some experience with customizing skeletal animations using Track Studio. Though this has always had extremely glitchy results for me when attempted in Mario Kart 8 Deluxe. However, last week we learned that when it comes to material animations, the way to avoid problems like these is to make the animation from scratch instead of editing an existing one. So that's exactly what I tried in the case of this skeletal animation for our custom scuttlebug. I keyframed all of these poses myself by hand. Sadly, Track Studio doesn't support any kind of smoothed animation curve editing, so it does look a bit jittery moving from keyframe to keyframe, but I think it's fine. And in-game, I can still barely believe how good this looks. This is a custom model with a custom animation replacing an object that is normally basically static, and yet I think this feels completely natural. Well, that is ignoring the fact that these things were floating at this point, so that's what I decided to work on next. I added 2 trees with branches that stick out across the gaps that perfectly align with the pivot points of the enemies. And although this required me to sacrifice the alignment of that tree stump detail we made last week, I really like the way these things turned out. I of course couldn't help but add cobwebs to these trees as well, and I might place more of those around the track once we get to detailing the whole thing. Though for now I had more pressing issues because did you notice that earlier? For some reason the collision of the spike ball, which I'd aligned my scuttlebug model to perfectly, wasn't working properly. After some testing, I realized that the only part of the collision I could interact with was that of the chain that should be above the spike ball, which made me realize that the collision of this object doesn't actually scale correctly relative to its model, which was a problem because I'd made the spike ball actor half its normal size. There was only one solution to this that I could think of at the time, which was to keep the spikeball actor its original size after all, which did mean I had to realign those trees since the placement of the scuttlebugs was completely different now. Honestly, I wasn't super happy with how this felt because the enemies were way bigger than they should have been and also sometimes nearly impossible to dodge now, so I did revisit this problem at a later point. For now, since I'd learned how to make proper skeletal animations, I wanted to address a different problem that I've actually been trying to deal with for years. See, this custom Bramble Pokey remodel, which was the very first thing I made for the track, has never looked 100% convincing in my eyes because its top leg doesn't properly touch the ground. Every attempt I've made at fixing this in the past didn't go well, but with my newfound custom animation skills, I wanted to give this idea one more shot. I figured it wouldn't be that hard to recreate most of the Bramble's animations by manually copying over the position keyframes from the Pokey's animations and only changing a few of the values to make the Bramble properly touch the ground. But this slowly became the most tedious thing I've worked on throughout this entire track creation process so far. See, because it wasn't possible for me to keep any of the keyframe curves from the original animations, I either had to accept that my Bramble wasn't gonna move smoothly whatsoever, or try to manually curve the animations by inserting even more keyframes. As you can imagine, all of that took an enormous amount of work, and when I checked out the result halfway through the process, it didn't even look that good. What ended up helping me a huge amount was to edit the original smoothed animations to get them to move the way I wanted in Track Studio, if not in-game, and then manually copy over the majority of that position data to the actual animations, so those could also appear at least somewhat smooth. So, after several mind-numbing hours of work, I got the Brambles looking pretty great to be honest, and not just in terms of animations. I also added the separated Bramble models for its destruction effect, scaled up its feet to match the size of the original Pokey hitbox, and scaled up the entire actor a bit to make it easier to drive under and properly align the model with its new animations. The only problem I wasn't able to solve is that the Brambles will sometimes snap their legs back on the ground instantly after respawning, because that's the result of the way the original game's Pokies are programmed that normally isn't visible because they're set to wait longer between each move. But either way, I hope you'll agree that for the most part, these things now actually look really quite polished, so I was happy I went down this rabbit hole. Going back to the scuttlebugs again, after coming to the realization that I really didn't want them to stay this big, I decided to try and figure out their hitbox problems as well. After more trial and error testing, I realized that shrinking the spikeball actor does still affect the size of its collision, just not its position relative to the pivot point. So after moving the Scuttlebug model down twice as far as it should be, and then setting the spike ball to half its usual size, I now had medium-sized Scuttlebugs with proper hitboxes. All I had left to do at this point was to line up the positioning of the branches of these trees for a third time, and this gimmick was finally fully functional. So that's the first item of this list done, but what about the second one? The problem with the blind jump leading up to the rotating log section is that it's only because of the angle of this part that the player can even make this jump, so I couldn't just lower the whole thing and keep the setup exactly the same. Therefore, I did lower this part of the road, but then I added a smaller ramp on top of that. So the idea is that the player can see the log from the side while still being able to actually make the jump. Putting a small ramp on a wider piece of road like this might look a bit inelegant, but to be fair, Nintendo did exactly the same thing in this part of DK Jungle that inspired this whole section. I like the idea that the drivers might struggle to cram onto the ramp and be forced to drop down into the water instead. Negating the dip into the water at the end of the log was as simple as pushing the edge forward a bit. But the players can still sometimes briefly touch the water despite the tweaked setup, even though the log can't be moved forward any further. So although I struggle to think of how I could do this in a way that doesn't look or feel off, I may have to add some kind of terrain extension or platform here if people feel like this still looks strange as it is. I would also have to add some rocks or a fence or something down here to make it clear to players that you can't drive under the log all the way anymore. By the way, I should mention that, of course, all of these subtle tweaks also required me to go back to some of the in-game elements we added previously and adjust them to fit the slightly altered layout. Alright, the next thing I tried to do this week was make this Lap 3 Wiggler gimmick a reality, but I'll warn you ahead of time that the process I took to try to achieve this was both convoluted and so far unsuccessful. Apart from messing with the game's code, the only way I could think of altering an actor once the player progresses through a percentage of the track is to use the dynamic track route system introduced in the Booster Course Pass. These convoluted maze tracks can not only change the layout of the intended path through the environment based on the player's lap position, but also spawn and despawn actors. So since the normal Maple Treeway Wigglers and the sleeping DS Mario Circuit version are actually two separate actors with separate models, my plan was to remodel one type to look angry and spawn those in with a higher speed value whilst deleting the normal yellow Wigglers as the player enters lap 3. The way the Booster Course Pass tracks change their route as the player enters different laps is that these tracks are actually just set up as fully segmented courses along the lines of Mount Wario. So in the case of tracks that feature two identical laps, the designers just placed two of these lap path loops directly on top of each other. Since I wasn't planning on changing the route of my track in any of the laps, but did still need to be able to detect which lap the drivers were on, I had to stack 3 layers of lap paths on top of each other. So before I committed to that task, I decided to try and actually fix the way the track's lap paths were set up. See, something I never mentioned when we first implemented this aspect of the track is that I quickly realized that the secondary shortcut lap path was a mistake. These things make it to where it's impossible for the player to jump down from the alternate route back to the main one without getting picked up by Lakitu. Obviously, the drivers should be able to fall down here and be forced to stick to the main path afterwards, and the only way to make that happen was to get rid of this secondary set of lap paths altogether. So I ended up making it to where the lap paths of the main route also cover the shortcut, meaning if you fall off you won't be able to get back up and are forced to continue as usual. The cool thing about this, and honestly the main reason I even bothered making this change, is that you can now jump back down to the main route from this part, which I'm pretty sure is actually a very efficient strategy. Either way, going back to the dynamic route implementation, now that I'd set up the lap paths properly, it was time to duplicate them so they could cover the track 3 times for each of its 3 laps. As you can probably imagine, this was quite finicky, since Track Studio isn't necessarily designed to support this kind of process. But it was around the time I finished this stacked lap path setup that I came to realize that I shouldn't be doing any of this yet. See, the thing that makes the dynamic track route gimmick so difficult to set up is that Track Studio doesn't even remotely support it. Making this stuff work for a custom track requires editing the track's raw data by hand. But worst of all, as I only found out at this point, apparently doing so relies on the order of the internal placement of the actors in the track file. Meaning, even if I were to set all of this up correctly, and then add a few more actors to the track, the whole thing would probably break. So technically, the only sane way of setting up any kind of dynamic track route element is to do so at the very end of the creation process, once no more actors need to be added or removed. Even then, the sketchiness of that has honestly kind of put me off the idea entirely. I'm not saying I won't give it another shot once the time is right, but for now it definitely isn't worth the hassle. Regardless, now that we gave all of these issues a shot, I felt like it was finally time to make some of what I'd planned to this week, starting with the starting line structure. The original game's starting line signs are kind of the encapsulation of the vibe of each respective track, so of course I wanted mine to incorporate wigglers and trees. More specifically, the plan was to sort of recreate this wooden wiggler sign from Super Mario Bros. Wonder and add the Mario Kart letters to it, and then hang it from a pair of trees flanking the starting line. So I cut out the various pieces of this design for reference, including the big sign on the back, gave that a proper realistic texture and some actual depth, and did the same for the wiggler elements. As for the Mario Kart text, I actually stole these letters from the Baby Park sign because I like their depth and I wanted them to contrast with the otherwise very wooden aesthetic. I put the text on a curve to line it up with the sign, and then I moved around the wiggler pieces to make them fit above it. I also added an additional foot to each body piece, since the way the original sign only has one foot per piece kinda throws me off. Finally, I made the Mario Kart letters sort of magenta or pink or whatever you want to call it, since I wanted them to stand out and match the color of the track's poison water. Then I added it to the in-game model, and why does it look so dark? Well, this isn't a glitch or anything, this was simply a result of the fact that the track's lighting was coming from the other direction. So fixing this was as simple as rotating the direction at which light hits the entire track model, which was easy to do, but does mean every part of the track we've made so far now looks slightly different in a way that took some getting used to. Regardless, I was extremely happy with how the custom sign turned out, meaning it was time to make it no longer float. So I created trees on either side by molding some cylinder shapes, then I also added some branches that look like they're supporting the sign, I created a lot of foliage, including vines, which I modeled by hand, and finally I added the actual starting line and grid. Looking at the finished thing in-game, I think this should give you an idea of what I want the level of detail of the entire track to feel like eventually. I'm planning on adding more vines and branches and bits of foliage all over the environment down the line, and with the addition of baked shadows and lighting, this should make the whole track feel relatively high quality. For now, on a completely different note, I decided that no matter whether I can or can't eventually make this a lap 3 only feature, I liked the idea of speeding up the track's wigglers and making them red and angry. However, as is the case for just about every map object in the game, the animation speed of the big wigglers isn't tied to their walking speed, so making them faster gave them this appearance of sliding across the ground. Therefore, after reworking the wiggler's textures and face model to make it look angry, I had to delve into the Track Studio animation editing mines one more time. My task was pretty straightforward in this case. All I had to do was remake half of the enemy's animations at twice their normal speed by copying over the keyframe data from the original animations, but skipping every other frame. Like I said, this was a very simple process, but stop me if you've heard this before, also a very tedious one. But after a couple more hours of grueling copy-pasting, I got this goofy idea to work. I say goofy because, just look at these guys. Their sped up animations honestly look absolutely hilarious in my opinion, though I also think this edit was a success either way. Now, I realized that it would be strange if this Wiggler themed track didn't feature any generic yellow Wigglers, ignoring the big one, so at this point I decided it was time to add a sleeping Wiggler actor to the track. As you may have seen in the original concept art I showed in the first episode, I was always planning on adding a sleeping Wiggler to the first turn, I just never quite figured out the logistics of such a setup. This actor wakes up after a customizable amount of seconds, then moves along its rails until it reaches the end of its loop off screen because it's impossible to make it just stop in place. Also, after creating a simple test setup, I realized my plan of having the Wiggler be on screen at the very start of the track was impossible, because it has this glitchy spawn animation. So I settled on placing the Wiggler up on this ledge next to a tree, from where I added a large amount of rail nodes all across the track's first and final segments to make it walk all the way to the water section, at which point it's supposed to turn around and walk back to where it spawned and fall asleep again. In-game, this mostly worked how I wanted it to. The idea is that I'll add some rocks here eventually to make sure the Wiggler doesn't float for a few seconds. You can see the Wiggler sort of awkwardly walk to its sleeping location if you start at a lower position, so I will have to add something to block the view from this angle. The only problem I encountered that I don't really know a fix for is that the flower on top of the Wiggler's head clips through that sign we just made. I personally think the cool factor of having the Wiggler walk across the starting line outweighs this visual glitchiness, but I guess let me know what you guys think. I could just move the sign up higher, of course, but that would make it even harder to see the full thing from up close. Regardless, from a gameplay perspective, this simple change adds a whole new dynamic layer to the track. The place where you encounter the Wiggler changes each lap and is also affected by your overall speed across the course, and I intentionally made it to where the Wiggler sometimes makes it difficult to take the flower gap jump shortcut. It is also possible to run into the Wiggler on the other side of the gap jump like this, which does feel kinda unfair, so I'll probably keep tweaking its movement path to prevent this kind of thing from happening. Anyways, the last thing I added to the track this week was fences, since these are basically required to hopefully add more visual details to the track's environment next week. I messed around with trying to make a custom fence type that resembles wigglers or brambles or something, but I came to the realization that a complicated design like this wouldn't fit the wild jungle vibe of the track. That's why I tried using these rope fences from Donut Plains, but after placing a few sets of those, I decided that they were not only too repetitive, but also had an unnecessarily high polygon count. So I ended up making a semi-custom fence type that maybe looks a bit generic and boring, but should fit in nicely with the future jungle foliage without drawing too much attention or anything. In terms of the placement of these things, the idea was to always keep a bit of off-road around the track's turns, whilst also fencing off most of the larger grass sections to allow for the placement of additional details later on. I did also keep those rope fences, but only in the underwater section for the sake of variation, I guess. Modeling these things didn't take that much time at all thanks to Blender's curve modifier. Honestly, probably the most time-consuming part of adding the fences was making sure they had proper simplified boxy collision. And yeah, that kinda minor addition marked the end of this week's progress. So now let's go check out our work in-game. Okay, and here we are, hello. So something weird about this week in particular, as far as the progress on the track goes, is that obviously this is by far the longest one of these videos yet, and I've worked on a lot of different stuff, and yet looking at the track in game right now, like it doesn't really feel like that much has changed compared to last week. And that's obviously because the changes we are making are more and more minor, like the starting sign or like the fences, which are kind of all over the place, but also don't actually have that much of a gameplay impact. And that's obviously just kind of like how it's going to be from now on. We're going to be working on like less and less of a significant aspect of the track relative to what we've made before. Because we're focusing more on visuals and details and stuff, and also because there will be more and more stuff that we've made in the past that like will seem like it's relatively much more impactful. But you know, that's just how it's going to be, and I hope you guys are still interested in what we'll be doing moving forward. This Wiggler here is also moving forward, epic segue. You just saw the flower clip through the sign, like I also complained about earlier. It is a bit of a thing, I don't know, I guess you could say that the flower is not really supposed to be solid, so I guess that's fine, but it does kind of bother me, though it's also something that like players are super unlikely to actually see, because obviously no one's gonna do the thing I'm doing now and just sort of like stalk the Wiggler like this. This is the point here where if you were to take the flower gap jump shortcut right now, the Wiggler would kind of would kind of block your path as you're jumping, which might seem a bit unfair. So I might change its path a little bit more in the future to potentially prevent that. It also just depends on like how much I run into that problem while playtesting the track and stuff. But I guess we'll just leave the Wiggler walking around. The Wiggler does go in a loop, so like it will also like go back up here and then fall asleep and then wake up again and just continue along its way, so we might encounter it later again. These brambles, I'm super happy about this. I know I always say like, oh, I'm super happy about how this turned out, but I'm really happy with how this turned out, because I can't emphasize enough, like, this was like the main thing that prevented me, or one of the main things that prevented me from starting this track like years ago, was the fact that I wanted the brambles to look like this as far as their animations go. And the fact that I couldn't get that to work was like such a point of frustration for me that I never bothered. But the fact that I got it to work even like retroactively whilst already starting work on the track as a whole is just like so satisfying, and I'm super happy with how these turned out. I mean, there are some problems I can point out, but like honestly, who cares? Like they're like 90% of the way there towards feeling official, and I think that's good enough. The fences here, like, I mean, I talked about how the rope fences I had originally felt a bit repetitive, and you might look at this and feel like, okay, well, this is also repetitive, but I am going to have all sorts of foliage and, like, maybe, like, vines and stuff that are going to be covering the fences, and making them feel more like a natural element of the track that you don't really think about, as opposed to how they are right now, which, I mean, it currently kind of feels like we're in like a weird Moo Moo Meadows kind of track or something, which, yeah, is strange. Oh, there you can see the Wiggler. I guess the Wiggler is about to walk up the yet to exist rocks there, yeah, and so it's gonna walk around. And then this is something players are never going to see, because we've already been playing through the track for 3 minutes now. Yeah, you can also kind of see it float there. I mean, I don't know. Obviously, as always, I might tweak stuff in the future, but yeah, now it's fallen asleep again, and it's going to take like another 20 or 30 seconds to wake up. I guess I'll start with the shortcut route this time, because it is quite a significant thing we worked on this week. Because we have the scuttlebugs, which, again, another element of the track that I am just over the moon about, because these things look amazing in my opinion. I mean, like, their animation is kind of simple, and their model isn't as detailed as some parts of Mario Kart 8 maybe should be, but, like, I mean, I think they just look great, and, like, I can tell you they're a remodel of the spike ball, and you can probably, like, see that, but I think most people aren't really gonna think about that, and they're just gonna feel like basically completely custom course elements, kind of like the brambles, I suppose. And in that sense, especially because I wasn't originally planning on having these be a part of the track until I got so much feedback about how boring these sections were, I'm super happy with how naturally these things ended up being incorporated into the shortcut route here. Obviously the jumps there, I mean, we kind of talked about this regarding the log section. These jumps are kind of blind also, but there really isn't much I can do about that. Also, I'm not going to demonstrate this, but you can also like fall down here now, and you can like drive around, and that's also cool. And yeah, we have the second Scuttlebug here, who's actually maybe easier to deal with than the first one because there aren't any boost panels like in this section. So that's kind of a weird counterintuitive thing that's just a result of the fact that we implemented the Scuttlebugs retroactively, but I don't think that's too big of a deal. Also, I just want to shout out this this tree here. Can I kind of show this tree? The model of the overhanging tree, like the way I made its roots sort of like go into the cliff face here and kind of wrap around. It maybe looks a bit like too polygonal if I like point it out, but I do think like it does look quite nice. And also obviously we have the cobwebs, and there's even more details that like no one's ever gonna see because they're up at an angle that the drivers will never look at. Like you can kind of see it from here, I guess. Yeah, there we go. You can actually see the Scuttlebug and the way it attaches to the branch up there. I guess we can just continue like normal over here. I don't really think much has changed. I guess I added a few cobwebs there as well, so that's pretty cool. Oh my god, we almost got the Wiggler to block us in the way I complained about. Yeah, so the Wiggler does sort of like move over to the right here, but to sort of counteract that potentially, but it's still too much. Like you can still almost not avoid running into the Wiggler if you take the shortcut route like that, which is a problem in my opinion. So I am gonna have to rework that, but that's just kind of how it goes with you know, like sort of retroactively incorporating more track elements, and I guess that goes to show how miraculous the implementation of the Scuttlebugs really is. Here we have these guys who are also very interesting and maybe not quite as seamless, or at least like, well, I don't know really. I think to some people, and to me at first at least, the walking animation just looked ridiculously goofy to the point where I considered like, okay, maybe I went too far, like maybe this doesn't look good, just because it's like so obviously the normal animation but sped up. But I do think this actually like looks fine, especially like whilst you're just driving through the track and not really paying too much attention to like the exact visuals of things. And also, I didn't really talk about this during the earlier part of the video, but actually getting the model of the face and stuff to look right did take a lot of effort because the normal Wiggler obviously doesn't have any like textures or models for the angry face. And so getting that to actually like look exactly how you'd expect angry Wigglers to look whilst using the specific Mario Kart 8 Wiggler model actually did take like maybe an hour or two of work, which I wasn't expecting. Yeah, but these guys, I mean, I think they're pretty good. Also, having them be like twice as fast weirdly doesn't really change the gameplay implementation of this section. Like, you might expect that to be like a drastic change in the way you have to navigate this part of the course, but really it's like almost exactly the same, which is fine in my opinion, because this section I think is fine as it is gameplay-wise. It does also definitely add to the stampede like idea of this section, like having the Wiggler sort of just slowly walk towards you doesn't really evoke the feeling of like chaos or like danger that this part of the track really was supposed to make the players feel like, and so having them be angry does work. Though I also do still feel like I also talked about at length, I would like the Wigglers to maybe just become angry in lap 3. I'm just not sure if I can actually make that work with how incredibly crazy the setup process for that is in regards to how it is in Track Studio and stuff, so I guess we'll have to see. Finally, I guess there's also the ramp here, which you can drop down on the sides. I made it to where you can't trick off of these ledges here, because that's also not how it works in the similar section in DK Jungle. And yeah, we just have the ramp, and the log section is ever so slightly longer now. Also, I guess we can see the Wiggler turn around here on the grass. That's amazing. And oh right, we also have the rope fences down here. I also had to separate these into the underwater material and the above water material to make sure they also had the proper like purpley lighting and whatnot. And I think these things look pretty good, and they definitely kind of help make this section feel sort of different from the rest of the track. Which, I mean, I think is good, because this is still probably the most visually, I don't know, good looking part of the track. And so I really did want to kind of keep that emphasis by also making the fences sort of unique and maybe slightly more visually detailed. Yeah, I think that's pretty much it for this for this ramble section of this video. I'm not really sure if there's anything else I haven't really talked about yet. I mean, there's the starting sign, which again I'm very happy about. It's gonna look even better once there's gonna be like ambient occlusion and stuff and shadows that are gonna make all of the different parts pop a little bit more. But currently, I think this looks good, and in general, I am, as always, happy with all the changes we made, and I hope you are as well. Okay, that's enough rambling for one video, I think. This is where I would talk about what I'm planning on doing next week and ask you to leave a comment with some suggestions regarding that aspect of the track, but my plans keep changing and you guys clearly don't need any encouragement when it comes to leaving interesting suggestions. So while you're doing that, please also consider giving the video a like and subscribing to the channel. I also have a public Discord server linked in the description, and if you want to support the channel and get early access to my videos, maybe consider signing up for a membership. Thank you so much for watching, and bye bye!